This is Carved from Unallocated, brought to you by Cellebrite.
2, 3, 4.
Cellebrite, digital intelligence for a safer world. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Carved from Unallocated. Today, we're bringing you the second episode in our Center of Excellence series, and we're going to talk all about what no one's telling the boss. So I sat down with Quinn. He's a member of the Center of Excellence, and not too long ago completed a 24-year career in law enforcement, where he finished up as a major at the Fairfax County Police Department. While he was there, he led the establishment of the Cyber and Forensics Bureau and several other key technical initiatives, including body-worn cameras, drones, and the Mobile Crime Lab program. Christian holds a Master's of Forensic Science from George Washington University, and he's a graduate of the FBI National Academy. He's also the founder of Fulcrum Innovation, which is a consulting practice focused on the intersection of public sector technology and associated policy and business issues. Christian is a valued member of our Center of Excellence here. He continues to support us, and we are happy to continue to support him. So let's listen into the interview here. I think you'll find a lot of value in what he's presenting. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, we are here today with Christian Quinn. Christian, thank you for joining the podcast again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. And as I talked about leading into this episode, I gave the listeners a little background on who you are, where you came from. Can you tell us from your perspective how you ended up where you are, where you were in your career that ultimately led to the establishment of this Cyber and Forensics Bureau at your agency and of course into today?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again. And like you said, I kind of had almost a two-part career where I spent a lot of time as a detective early on. Had worked for a small agency before joining Fairfax County PD in Virginia, and was really fortunate to have spent most of my professional life at a big, well-resourced agency in an area like the National Capital Region, where there's just a lot going on. There's a lot of agencies that are also well-resourced and a lot of partnerships with federal and state agencies. So spent as you mentioned, about 8.5 years as a detective, and then moved up through the leadership ranks, spent a couple stints as a sergeant and second lieutenant overseeing investigations as a supervisor, and then took kind of like a more funny path where people used to joke that I kind of rode one crisis to the next, where the year after Sandy Hook, I got promoted, and as a commander, my first job was the full-time liaison to the school system, largest PD in Virginia, largest school system in Virginia, at a contentious year like that, where just a lot of emotions were high, and did a whole bunch of crisis planning and some other things, and then was promoted into a role as a captain, and did a couple of things, and that was sort of during some complicated years where Ferguson had happened and some other things, so got assigned to a policy project for a while, learned a lot, didn't love doing that work, but really important work in terms of making sure that we were doing the right things and engaging with community stakeholders. And then when I made major, my first stop was as a patrol bureau major. So I had a great boss, the deputy chief, who's now the chief of another agency. And she had mentioned one day that just in terms of organizational priorities and things that were coming down the pike, that the department wanted to have a full-time cyber and forensics bureau where they wanted to combine conventional forensics, like your typical CSI resources, with all of our digital capability. And I asked, well, who's gonna take that job? And she said, well, I don't know. We'll probably voluntold somebody who gets promoted into the role of major that's their new job. And I just without reservation said, I'd like to have that job. I'd like to do that. And that was actually a fit when I pointed out, my academic background. I had a master's in forensics that I got at GW, which is how I ended up in the DC area. I'm actually from Boston. Okay. And came down and ironically, I worked cases for almost 9 years, but I never worked the back end forensics. I always worked the front end in terms of the criminal investigation. But had occasion to work in organized crime and intel, and I was there during 9/11. I was there during the Beltway sniper event and some other big things. And in that window of time, really kind of galvanized my notion that, connecting the dots is paramount, that you cannot solve complex crime without being able to link actors, without able to look at associations, without being able to pull back the curtain and see what's really going on in the case. So that kind of shaped some of my thinking around that time. And also leading up to that point, I'd always had kind of a penchant for technology anyway. I designed a couple of IT courses along the way when I became when I got promoted into leadership roles, where I'd get there and there's just some business process that was a mess. I designed a auto theft case management system, kind of self-taught, worked on it with a couple of peers, worked on an extradition organizing system when I was the supervisor of fugitive units. So as much as I enjoyed the conventional action-oriented parts of policing, increasingly as I became a boss, I kept finding these kind of deficiencies and opportunities to fix things. And usually it was technology that afforded us the best options for modernizing. So embarked on this kind of journey to get the Cyber and Forensics Bureau going. And the first step was really absorbing existing sections within the agency. So like I said, we had a really good crime scene section that was off and running. We had a biometric section that was doing all of our automated fingerprints and other things, and absorbed that. And then had a really neglected digital forensics section that was almost their supervisor worked in another building, who was actually the supervisor of the technical investigation section. So there was only a handful of them, and they were almost like peer supervised. So absorbed them, absorbed the technical investigation section. And basically from there, it was kind of, no budget, no extra bodies, get it going. But thankfully, I absorbed a lot of good people who were already doing good work, and just put a little bit of governance and definition around that, and then started making the case for more positions and looking at, okay, what are we going to actually prioritize, and looking at grant opportunities, looking at alternative funding, whether it was equitable sharing or other things that were available, looking at some collaborative partnerships, looking at task force opportunities, and thinking about how are we really going to enhance our capability and get us to where we need to be. So I was fortunate that I recruited a supervisor who was in Intel, who, when I was an auto theft lieutenant, he had worked for me as a detective. He was working on his master's in high technology crime, and I thought he'd be a good addition over here. So he came over as our first digital forensics lieutenant, who was dedicated solely to that section. And through some lobbying and some other articulation, managed to get some more examiners in there, managed to get some funding. And when we actually had money to spend, one of the first things I prioritized was our capacity to do cell phones. I was really lucky that around the same time we were moving into a new headquarters, and the troops who were working digital forensics had a really strong voice in what did they need. So we actually had a dedicated chip-off room built. Their digital forensic workstations were actually designed around their needs, where they had redundant power. They had their build boards and their forensic tools all around them set up as they wanted it. We had a dedicated Faraday cage. So we had a lot of resources that a lot of places don't have. We had the ability to have a dedicated cooled server room with proper airflow and again, redundant power. So some of it was luck. Some of it was just good people that lent some expertise, and some of it was just hoping for the best based on the experiences I had already had and the perspective I brought to it.
It almost sounds like a master class in how to set up a digital forensics group or bureau, right? I mean, you had, from what I can tell, right, and speculation here based on what you're saying, supportive command,
yep.
Right, from probably the chief down.
The agency, not that there was a set way that we knew we were going to do it, but we knew it was an organizational priority, where the chief and deputy chief had said, this issue is growing and we need to align our agency for the foreseeable future to make sure we're ready to meet those challenges.
Do you think, did your chief and everybody on the command, including you, did you guys see something different? Maybe it's regional, maybe it's because you're so close to DC. Was there something that you guys and girls saw that told you, hey, this is coming and this is going to be big and it's just going to grow and get more and more, as opposed to other agencies that even today are still still figuring it out and haven't quite come to terms with what digital evidence is.
Yeah, I think it was the sheer prevalence of digital in every case, and not just like your organized crime, vice type cases, but like your major crimes.
Yeah.
When you think about your typical gang homicide, there was a time when you would do a records and document warrant on some place, and you were hoping to go in there and get like address books or names written on paper. We had gotten to a point where you're walking out of some place with everybody's phones, the router. You want to see like, when is the last time? Because a lot of times in those homicides, it's, hey, when is the last time that somebody's phone connected to the Wi-Fi here or connected to this router? Or when is the last time somebody posted on social? Like if they've gone missing, these are sort of indicators like, hey, they've either been killed and they've disappeared, or they're still alive and they're viable, or someone's in possession of their device. So we started to approach a lot of cases like that. And you think about cases where you have these kind of whodunits where somebody's shot in a parking lot and there's rumor that there was a fight in a nightclub or a bar nearby. The way we're doing that now is there was a time you're gumshoeing your way around, canvassing like who saw what. But and not that those conventional methods aren't still important, but the reality is you need to be looking at like, where are all the cameras? Do they have an ATM machine inside? Let's look at all the credit card transactions from within the establishment, because odds are somebody left digital crumbs somewhere. What other cameras might they have walked by? What other ATMs are in the area? If it comes to it, I mean, we've had some that were really, really bad triple homicide with not a whole lot to go on. And you start doing cell tower dumps to isolate what numbers are typically in the area, what numbers were in the area at that time, and then how are those folks, and you do start with a wide pool that you shrink down, and then starting to look at like, who was left there. So I think we had a couple of bigger events that highlighted the need for digital capability, but we also just had a general acknowledgement that like, hey, this is not a nice to have. In some cases, this is kind of like the starting point in most cases.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, and I'm thinking back to my career in law enforcement, when I was a detective and doing digital forensics, and where we got to a point where we started developing maps of where all the cameras were in our places, especially where there's high crime, right, or higher than normal crime rates. Whereas, okay, we know that this building has a camera, and we know this is our contact person, and either they're friendly, they'll give us what we need, or you need a subpoena for this people. Yeah. So there is definitely, yes, a shift. Which kind of brings us, from to where back in the day that was almost an outside the box thing. Like, oh, we're going to do a tower dump. What do you mean a tower dump? What are you going to do with that? You're going to get so much info. Well, we don't have anything else, right? To where it was almost a last resort. To now, things like tower dumps and geofences are almost, like you said, a normal part of nearly every investigation. Certainly anything that's involves death or great bodily harm, right? It's one of the checklists now. It's, hey, let's call out the homicide detective and the digital forensics guy too, right? We need him here to be available to start doing the work. So bringing us up into today, right? Where are we at today, especially with regards to digital evidence management, things like that, things that law enforcement needs to be paying attention to. And of course, the theme on here in this episode, what nobody tells the boss, right? Where are we at that the boss needs to be aware that we need to start moving in that direction?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things that you come to. There's like an arc of things that you're doing. So maybe the first one is you're enhancing your capability to actually collect and extract and analyze what the data that you get. But the challenge is this: is you could add a handful of examiners, or you could add a bit of capability where you're able to dump, let's say phones, let's say whatever it is, where you're able to get more data off of more devices, and you're able to carve into your digital evidence backlog. The challenge after that is, what are you doing with that? And I think that's probably one of those areas that most agencies, I had the opportunity last year to go out on some of these Reconnect events, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, multiple agencies at each one, do some other customer focus groups here in DC, Northern Virginia. And, I kept waiting for that moment where somebody was going to say, we do this, this, and this with respect to, here's how we do our collection. Here's how we do our process for extract. here's how we do our analysis, and here's how we do our data storage. And here's how we do evidentiary sharing with respect to prosecutors and other stakeholders within the agency, maybe even media relations for certain things. And what I found was nobody really at the state and local level is doing this really well. That's not a critique. It's just kind of an acknowledgement that as a profession, we've had digital kind of creep up on us and we're behind. Some agencies more so than others, some agencies just glaringly deficient. Other agencies doing pretty well in the way of extraction and analysis. But, your typical model is you collect something, let's say it's a cell phone, digital forensic examiner hooks it up, defeats first encryption to get in. And that bears noting as well. There was a time, like when I way back when I was an organized crime detective, that you get a very elementary phone that it might not have even been protected by any kind of encryption. Like you could just like hook it up and dump it.
Yep.
But now that's the norm. Like every phone is going to be like password or biometric protected. And it's probably going to have internal features that come from the manufacturer where after an hour it reverts to some kind of before first unlock state where it's like got a deeper level of encryption or a more challenging lock to bypass and get it through. And you find that you're getting what you need off of it, but there's two deficiencies in the back end. And this is where I think there's a gap between what detectives and digital forensic examiners know and maybe what their immediate supervisors know and what chiefs and other law enforcement executives know. They may hear like, oh, this is a problem. But I think where we're failing is we've come to just accept that, well, there's a whole bunch of digital evidence and we don't have the resources to keep pace with it. And that's, in the modern age, it's not acceptable because there's a whole bunch of risks, liabilities there. At the very least, we're not serving the community or our workforce as effectively as we ought to. But probably the two biggest deficiencies are, by the time you've got data off of a device, you've done all the hard work of locating the device, getting your search warrant, getting your court order, getting what you need off of it, extracting the data, figuring out what you needed, keeping within scope, getting it onto something that you can preserve. Because, like when you think about if you've got a 500 gig device to go through, with your forensic report, now when you're done, you've got like 750 gigs because it's about, half of, what you're extracting and preserving, and you've got to preserve the original. And you've got something you've got to store, that you've got to keep, that you've got to authenticate, and you've got to bring to court. And ideally, if you're doing it right, you've got something that you can now leverage, that you can do cross-case analysis, because the reality is the criminal subculture, they're not divided into silos. They don't recognize the jurisdictional border. So the same guy who's out there doing street robberies one day might be a gang member and might be slinging fentanyl another day. So that phone number, that nickname, that person, maybe even an image is going to show up in multiple cases. But if you don't automate that process, you're just missing that. And one of the things that happens is, we would give detectives a forensic report, we'd give them a dump on a phone or something like that. And really savvy detectives will look at their report and say like, oh, that's so-and-so's number, that's so-and-so's number, or that nickname is actually so-and-so, their real name. And that's great. It's a testament to the dedication. It's a testament to their memory. It's a testament to what they're able to, the deep dive they take on their case. But we can't count on that because nobody remembers all that they've come to know in a case. And certainly nobody remembers or knows what anybody else has found on their case or what they need on their case. And the point is, digital forensics examiners are trying to just do the best job they can to serve the detectives who are working cases and get them what they need or what they ask for, what they specifically ask for, not serve the whole agency at broad, but to give this detective what they need to prove the elements of their offense. Those detectives are head down, and they are trying to prove the case that is in front of them and bring the best case they can to court. So they're getting what they need off of a device. They're getting what they need out of the ecosystem of somebody's technical life and bringing what they need to court. What agencies need are, and this is the challenge, is somebody in leadership has got to be thinking about this issue globally. Somebody has got to be thinking about how are we best serving the whole agency, not just having them with basic tools to get by to solve one case at a time, Because ideally, it's not about just solving cases, it's about preventing future crime. It's about finding things before they happen, like looking at really conspiracy activity, especially when you have anything that looks like gang or organized criminal activity, youth violence that accounts for an awful lot of the shootings that we're having right now, is looking at who out there is planning to do something, who out there has obtained a firearm, who out there is plotting to do something. And you're not going to hear that stuff word of mouth. That stuff is all in the digital world, and that's where you really need to be looking.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think you already answered this, but how urgent is this issue today?
It's absolutely pressing, and I don't want to just be condemning to my former profession. I think some of this bears explaining. If we go back 15 years, and you look at like 2007, we had at scale in the U.S. kind of this economic meltdown. I mean, you could say, more broadly, globally, we had economic recession. But 2007, particularly in the United States, you look at your typical state and local agency, and those agencies are dependent upon a myriad of funding. But generally speaking, it comes down to your tax base. It comes down to publicly allocated funds. It might be more commercial real estate. It might be more residential. It may be some other things. You have some programs that are kept afloat with like federal grants. But the reality is, during that economic meltdown, most agencies were looking at how can we keep our workforce? How can we avoid layoffs and riffing current employees? How can we even continue to keep cars on the road, keep essential equipment up, host training that might be mandated by some kind of state standard like firearms training or CPR and other mandated training? So nobody was really investing heavily in technology then. And you could say like, hey, that event only lasted a couple of years in terms of economic downturn. But in the public sector, you're not really getting that trickle down recovery for another couple of years. So now it's like 2010, 2011 before you're even like really getting your feet under you again. You come up to around 2014 and we have the first iteration of social justice in Ferguson, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and chiefs and law enforcement leaders, understandably so, are far more focused on transparency and accountability. Add to that you have some misunderstood notions about technology where leaders are very hesitant to invest in technology that could be viewed as some kind of surveillance apparatus, even though we know digital forensics has nothing to do with that. You can't do any of this work without having possession of a device, without someone being aware that you took their stuff, oftentimes without serving a search warrant so that they're getting a copy of the affidavit cover and they know a search warrant is being done on the device. But because of those confused notions about technology, a lot of times agencies or the municipality itself doesn't want to fund technical initiatives. And the other piece to this is just how digital forensic technology and other technologies have evolved. There was a time when you would procure something and you would make a big purchase, one-time purchase, and take something out of a box and you owned it, or it got installed on your servers and this was something that you own that maybe you paid for some upkeep, you paid for some employee training. But the reality is the current model, like where you're typically using software as a service, which is a great model, it doesn't lend itself to what has historically been public sector year to year, maybe 2-year budget cycles with line items augmented by grant funding and occasional windfalls that were like, we've got money left over that didn't go to something else. So there's been a challenge in terms of investing in the tools that we really need to invest in. But look at what's happened from a digital standpoint, the backdrop of this whole environment. Like I can remember the first time it was announced that a cell phone was going to have 1 terabyte of storage on it. And it was like, to put that in perspective, that's something that goes in your pocket that's got more memory, storage, and computing power than most of the desktop computers that a lot of us might have like grown up with as the first machines that we bought. And the first 10 years of desktop computers, those cell phones are considerably more powerful with more storage. Fast forward to now, and the device itself is almost the least of your worries because the device with apps and everything else now serves as a portal to messaging apps that are typically encrypted, cloud-based storage or storage somewhere else that might be encrypted or owned by some third-party vendor that you've got to now do additional court orders or search warrants to even get access to that. That app or messaging service might not even exist in the United States and recognize the authority of a U.S. court. So there's all kinds of challenges there. And this problem has kind of crept up on us a little bit. So I do want to give leaders who perhaps overlooked this a bit of a pass. But now we know what we know. And I mean, we're really underwater. And this is kind of dire. The other thing that we could probably talk about more is just kind of the state of how digital investigations are done in most agencies.
Yeah, they're definitely. I want to get into that before we do. Just speaking on what you've just talked about, and really, it's interesting because you brought up a great point about not only the chief, from a boss standpoint, but the municipality as well, right? As a whole, the commissions, the people who control the purse strings, right? What if we remain underwater, if we don't get there, if we don't start making these changes in law enforcement for those that are still working on catching up? What are our consequences? What are our risks? What's the potential issues here?
So at the very least, it's a loss of organizational competency. If you can't, the police wear a whole bunch of hats. And there's just a lot of jobs, and there's just been increasingly more and more heaped on law enforcement to contend with all kinds of societal ills and challenges. But at baseline, you got to be able to solve crime. You got to be able to keep communities safe. You got to be able to get some semblance of justice for victims. And if you can't solve crime, particularly when you can't solve crime at scale, there's a loss of confidence in the agency. And not just externally, but internally too, where I remember we did a workforce survey, and this was kind of, it's a risk at the time, but we asked our workforce 3 questions, and we asked, have you ever encountered digital evidence in the field and just left it there because you thought it wasn't worth collecting? Have you ever encountered digital evidence in the field, collected it, but just put it in the property room and didn't even submit it for a digital examination because you thought, they're just never going to get to it? Or have you ever collected digital evidence but thought, we don't have enough internal capability to even get this done, I'm going to ask somebody at some other agency or some entity to do it for us? And without, drilling into like granular numbers, generally speaking, the answer to every one of those questions was about a third, like 32 to 34% of every one of those questions was, yes, we've done that. And that's really alarming and disheartening. And I came from a well-resourced professional agency where we had digital capability. So I would challenge leaders, when you look at what your backlog is, when you think about how big the problem is, this is kind of one of those first things that nobody tells you, is that, your workforce is leaving evidence out there because they look at it like it's not even worth collecting. It's not even worth the headache. Or they're collecting evidence and it's just sitting on a shelf in a property room with nobody looking at it at all. And I can tell you that if you can't get to your backlog, a lot of those are, I don't want to be an alarmist, but they're kind of like ticking time bombs if it's the wrong stuff. Because when you think, like I've seen cases, not at my agency, but at a neighboring agency, where a middle school employee had sexually abused kids in school. He was HIV positive, and he came to the attention of law enforcement for potentially having explicit images on his phone. Because it took months and months and months to get around to doing that one phone, nobody had probable cause to lock the guy up, because it's just like one more case in a pile of cases, one more device in a pile of devices that all have priority, that are all important. And they finally get around to doing this device, and they find evidence that he sexually abused kids on the premises. And I can share with you that the media, the community, were just up in arms with that agency and their elected officials. Like, why did it take this long to get to this? Because you could have locked this guy up while he was still out here having access to kids on school grounds. And who knows, like what damage was done or what could have been prevented had they just had the investigative capacity to get to that. And again, I'm not condemning that particular agency, but that's one example. And I think if you look at how this plays out at scale, there's that potential loss of public trust. As I mentioned, of what we saw in our survey, and I'd like to think, we were a pretty capable agency. Your own workforce ends up thinking like, hey, we're just not good enough to do this. We just don't have the capability to do this. So those are the kinds of things that you really need to be thinking, almost from a self-assessment standpoint, be thinking quite critically, like how much more could we be doing? And at scale, what crime is not being solved that we might otherwise be drawing correlations and being able to break open because we have devices sitting on shelves, or worse, being left in the field because we're just not addressing this digital evidence problem to the extent that we ought to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so building on what you just said and this theme of what nobody tells the boss, what other urgencies are out there? What other concerns do you think exist, especially in law enforcement today when it comes to digital evidence?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about digital investigative capacity. Sort of the natural evolution of that is you do the investigation. What do you do with the report? What do you do with the data? And that is the next area that is just glaringly deficient. If we had a detective who swung by the Division of Forensic Science and picked up a half a kilo of cocaine, and then went by the property room and picked up a firearm that was used in a violent crime, and took that evidence to their house, took it back to their office, had it riding around in the trunk of their car for a month and a half, that person would be fired and potentially criminally prosecuted, because we would all be able to look at that and say that is glaringly unacceptable. But when it comes to digital evidence, it's not that we're turning a blind eye to it. There's just a lack of awareness where a lot of times digital forensic examiner does what they need to do. And if it's a smaller case, maybe they put it on a thumb drive and they hand it to a detective, and the detective puts it in their case file or their briefcase, and they bring it to the prosecutor and they plug it into a machine and they all look at it together. And there's no evidence of authentication. There's no audit trail associated with that. There's no indication as to when they plugged it into their desktop at their workstation. There's no indication as to when the prosecutor viewed it. Maybe the prosecutor needs to comply with discovery, or they want to have a meeting with defense counsel, so they bring the thumb drive, or they burn a copy of something and give it to the defense. And again, there's no audit trail. There's no controls on that. There's no authentication or specific hashing that is transferable. And this is a problem. And eventually and I will submit to you that is more the norm than not because of this deficiency in storage. And one of the things I used to say, I certainly wasn't shirking responsibility, was that this is not, as the cyber and forensics commander, as the major over that capacity, it's really not my issue to fix, nor is it my people's problem to fix. We just happen to be the people who see it the most glaring, because digital forensic examiners finish, especially in a big case where you say you have like one of these prolific child sex abuse material cases where you have some like lifelong actor and you just search warrant at their house and you're leaving with multiple storage devices and you've got 20 terabytes of data, which is not outside feasibility. I've heard of cases that were even bigger than that. Yep. And now it's like, well, where do we put that? That's not going on a thumb drive. That's so you have these scenarios where detectives are literally walking around with reams of CDs and Ziploc bags filled with thumb drives. That stuff belongs on some kind of enterprise-wide server that has authentication features associated with the evidence, that has an audit trail, that you don't have to go bring the thumb drive to the prosecutor. You can send them a link and you can show them what you're looking at, that you can send defense counsel a link that expires so that it's not just going out there into the wild. Because the challenge is this: sooner or later, either a big case is going to be lost because of these deficiencies, or we're going to potentially re-victimize our victims. Because imagine the contents of a thumb drive associated with a rape, where you have images from the sex assault itself, bodily injuries to the victim, where you have details related to the perk kit, where you have details related to the interview, suspect statements, police reports, and all that on a thumb drive somewhere, and that just innocently falls out of someone's briefcase and is sitting in the parking garage or the parking lot outside of court, and now somebody there on a court case who's not a friend of the police and not going to do the right thing picks that up and puts that out on social media or like more broadly like some darknet site and just rapidly accelerates it. And think of the humiliation and degradation to a victim that could be solved and saved by just having better practices. And it's the same for like child sex abuse material, where we have a detective goes to court with like a WD passport or some other big external storage medium that is capable of handling a lot of video and images, and they leave that behind on the bench in court, or it falls out in the police station's parking lot. These are all vulnerabilities that are fixable, that we shouldn't tolerate, that we should not be operating under the assumption of hoping for the best and hoping that to not get challenged on these sloppy methodologies. And I think maybe for some years we had to give agencies allowances because it was like, well, this is such a big problem, it's crept up on all of us. But the reality is we've got to go back to the municipalities that are responsible for budgeting for agencies and say, hey, this is a problem waiting to happen, and it's not going to end good. What is the value of maintaining public confidence and public trust? What is the value of offsetting a potential lawsuit where the agency is made to pay out because we have victimized countless minors by having explicit images get out into the wild that before were just sitting on one person's server?
Yeah. And to steal from what we were talking about before we started this today, as far as the options available to agencies, right? We can't ask them to get into the data storage business.
Yeah.
So, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think historically, a lot of times in government, we had kind of this aversion to the cloud, where it's this abstract idea of like, well, we don't know where our data is. And I think when you've professionally grown up in policing, if you will, when we correlate digital to the physical world, it's sort of like, hey, I know back in that room there that's locked or that's behind a proxy access or the file cabinets, contained therein are our files, and the file cabinet is locked. And we've kind of maintained that same mindset over our digital evidence and our data, where we think to ourselves like, well, having the server on premises here in this room is good. But the challenge is data, and not just in public safety, everywhere, data is just exploding. And there's a lot of considerations that you really have to give with respect to data. One is it's got to be on redundant power. Two is it's got to be in a room that has adequate airflow and cooling to make sure that you are able to preserve those servers. And then when you get into the weeds of it, you don't want it in your basement where a lot of things go, because there's the potential for either humidity or water to get down there. You don't want it on the top floor in any kind of attic setting because heat is a problem as well. So I often say, if you're, now knowing what we know, if you're not in the data storage business, don't put your agency in the data storage business, because whatever you think your data storage needs are, when you start, and add to that, we've got either in-car video or body-worn camera video or just your CAD RMS data. Data is going to continue to go up exponentially for the foreseeable future. And a lot of these cloud options, if you're working with a reputable provider that is adherent to CJIS protocols, that is mindful of proper cybersecurity standards, what you're seeing are these shared responsibility models where the agency as a customer is responsible for the access management to the data, but the vendor doesn't even have access to their data. What they're securing is the infrastructure around it. And from a cost standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to outsource that, because police data is different in that the nature and content of it is different, but it's also different in that we don't have discretionary authority typically over how long we're going to keep data. So if you're talking about some case, it's like some stranger whodunit, violent crime that you have to keep the evidence for 75 years or 99 years, or it's subject to appeal and you've got to keep it even longer. For all intents and purposes, a lot of our data we're on the hook for forever from a budgeting standpoint. So if that's the case, the cloud offers you more options in the way of you can have data that's readily accessible. and you can have what's called cold storage or iceberg or some other variant of that. But basically, it's data that it's not necessarily at your fingertips, that you can't immediately download, but it's still there, that you can comply. And I think about cold cases. I think about records management information that you're on the hook for because you have to keep it, but nobody in the foreseeable future has to access it or touch it. You can store that for, pennies on the dollar in some instances if you're willing to forego some of your immediate access to it. So there are a lot of options there. And I think we just need to rethink how we consider the cloud, because the other piece to the cloud isn't just the storage, it's computing. And going back to the digital forensics piece, I can recall my team having to buy gaming computers because we needed something with sufficient horsepower so that we could deal with some of these bigger files, so that we could deal with some of the more complex programs, bigger video and things like that. And we needed things to render more quickly. The challenge is, you think like, oh, I'm good. We spent all this money on these gaming computers and 18 months later, they're obsolete. They're just not getting the job done. By leveraging the cloud and cloud computing, a lot of times, so long as you can sufficiently upload what you need to, some of these digital forensic processes actually take place in the cloud. And again, you're not buying infrastructure, you're not maintaining that. It's being done somewhere else. You just need sufficient horsepower to upload it and sufficient download speed so that you can then get it back when the examination is complete.
Yeah. And I know not everybody's aware, right? But I mean, even just speaking about the two prevalent cloud providers out there, AWS and Azure, right? Amazon and Microsoft. They both have GovCloud environments that are data centers that are even more secure than your typical data center. And as long as you uphold, like you said, the shared responsibility model, as long as we as law enforcement uphold our end of the bargain, they're going to uphold theirs, because that is their, we were talking about risk earlier and things and destroying trust. That is their risk.
Absolutely.
Right? If something gets compromised, and there are federal government agencies that are keeping highly secure material in these GovCloud environments, the same place that we can put this CGIS data, right? That we can put these extractions. So putting on your commander hat, it sounds like you are pro cloud.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I think when you look at it, the fact that maybe you can't physically look at where the server is, it's not a bad thing.
Right.
Where your responsibility falls is the same as it's always fallen. Because even if your server is sitting in your back room locked up, if it is connected to the web in any way,
right,
that's where your intrusion comes from. It's not going to be the guy creeping in the middle of the night disguised as the custodian who picks the lock and steals the data that way and attaches something to your server. It's going to be somebody who probably through either phishing or some other vector comes into your server by way of a web attack and compromises credentials or something else to get access to your data. And they're the same protocols that you've got to employ to keep data safe on your server are the same protocols you've got to employ to keep data safe on somebody else's server. You're just doing yourself the favor of outsourcing all the infrastructure and all the physical security that goes with that.
Yep. And the reliability, we can...
Yeah, absolutely.
The replication, especially across geographical areas, there's so many pluses to it. And I think it's probably one of the newer-ish. You know, it's been around for a while, but really, especially in law enforcement, it's newer. It's just... I think most state agencies are just kind of coming to terms
I think in government, particularly public safety, there was a bit of an aversion to putting things on servers that we didn't directly have control over. But the reality is, in terms of both cost and the benefits of outsourcing those risks and not having to maintain the infrastructure, there's significant advantages to considering cloud if you're going with the right partner.
Yeah, there is an agency that I work with that just filled up a petabyte of on-prem server, on-prem storage for their digital evidence, and they're starting on their second petabyte.
Yeah.
And to me, that is, and this is on-prem, and it's not, to me, realistically sustainable. The amount, like you said, infrastructure, the cost for that storage even today versus literally logging into your, X cloud account and saying, provision me additional storage, or having storage that automatically expands. The benefits that are available today are far outweigh, I think.
And however long it took to fill up that first petabyte, I guarantee it's going to take less time to fill up the second one.
Oh yeah, it's exponential. It's just going to grow. It's insane. And I've had customers as well that have lost data, right? Literally due to flooding. I work a lot in Florida. We have a lot of hurricanes. We have a lot of issues. and it's happened. And the nice thing with these data centers is, I mean, the in order to lose your data with a cloud provider, one of the major cloud providers, I mean, you would have to have several catastrophic events happen across the country.
Right. It's almost going to be explainable.
Right. Yeah.
As opposed to the sprinkler went off in your building.
Yeah. Or I left the thumb drive, in the courthouse. And I've had, because I mean, it's funny. You're saying these things and things that we haven't talked about that I have literally had customers tell me, oh, I've had detectives drop thumb drives and I found it in the parking lot. I've had, we've lost data. We're filling up. We have no room for storage. So having talked about all of this stuff, right? This cloud issues, the storage issues, the need for law enforcement agencies to do so many things and really change what they're doing. Why aren't people telling the boss? Why does nobody tell the boss?
I think it's a handful of reasons. One is, it's just kind of a symptom, if you will, of your typical paramilitary organization, or that command and control leadership structure where police are very good about making do. This is how it is. I'm going to go off and be a good soldier and do my job despite not having the things I'm supposed to have.
Yeah.
So they don't want to necessarily complain. The other thing is, I think sometimes you have middle managers who are concerned about being pests, where they don't want to keep ringing the same bell. As much as the squeaky wheel gets the oil, this is a problem that needs a lot of oil. And it's not just the squeaky wheel that needs it. Typically, this is a problem that needs to be solved at a more enterprise level. And, digital, because it's almost an abstract concept, kind of takes a back seat to whatever's burning that day. What's the tyranny of the day that has to be addressed because we've just got to get to it? Mm-hmm. What is it that we just got to buy because we're either making do or because it's a fancier shiny object that is going to pay better dividends or is more tangible as to like the benefit that it adds. Digital is kind of like it's like fixing the HVAC at your house. You might spend a lot of money and not immediately see the benefit, but if you just keep letting it go until it completely breaks down or it comes back to haunt you, you're going to pay a lot more in the long run. And we talked about, those liabilities and those challenges. I think the hard thing is making this presentable in such a way that it's digestible, where, if we talked about, hey, we need a new physical evidence room, most people would wrap their heads around like, okay, how many square feet does it need to be? And what kind of shelving do we need? And what kind of physical security do we need? And what kind of identity and access management are we going to have in place? And how many people are going to have to work that? That is something that we can all kind of get our heads around. Not that we've ever worked construction and design and that sort of thing, but it's just part of the physical world. It's just easier to grasp. When we start talking about terabytes and petabytes and cloud and things like that, for a lot of our team members and coworkers and leaders, like those are kind of abstract comments where the concept is sort of understood, but it's sometimes like so big, it's like, oh, I don't know, where do we even start with this? And the other thing is, if you have a chief or somebody that's new in their seat, they may not want to go to their bosses, the elected officials or political appointees, and say, hey, I need to significantly increase my budget for something that does not obviously have measurable gains for the community that's very visible that we can pull out and say, look what we're doing now. But the reality is we're offsetting these future liabilities. We're policing in a more appropriate, civically responsible way because we're being better stewards of the data that we do collect. And we're leveraging data at a greater scale so that we're able to solve more crime, keep more people safe, give more victims justice, and make life easier on our workforce as well. Because the reality is this is the future of policing. This is not like a fad right now. This is not something that, well, if we just wait, each year this is going to get exponentially more challenging. So at a certain point, you've got to just dive in and say, okay, this is going to be a priority. And like anything else that has kind of been neglected or has kind of crept up on us, in the beginning, it's going to hurt a bit to make that investment. And you're going to have to make choices as to, well, what aren't we going to do because we're going to finally get around to remedying this situation?
Yeah. And it's I think hard to swallow. A lot of us, especially in law enforcement, right? We kind of grow up away from the software world and realize,
Sure.
that I need to buy Microsoft Office. I'm going to go spend $150 at the store, right? Whereas now we're talking about these enterprise class things that are needed that cost a little bit more money. How? So let's say we tell the boss, right, or the boss tells his boss. How do we? Is there a way? Is it possible to make them understand that this is something that needs to be done now, and you can't wait until you've had a catastrophic event, whether it's a mass casualty, where it's like, hey, if we would have had this in place, we could have addressed some of these issues easier, or a mass data loss or a loss of a high profile case, right? Is there anything that can be done, do you think, in your opinion, that can help them understand that need?
So I think, you look at like other things that just are unfortunate events. And I think not that we want to be alarmist or anything, but that we want to look at that and say like, hey, this is an avoidable situation. And it is one where it's not just we're insuring against bad things happening in the future. We're enhancing our capability now. When you've got detectives that are overworked, when we're struggling to retain staff, when we can make their job easier by automating certain features, when we can turn cases around faster, when we can solve more cases, we're going to increase the satisfaction and motivation of our workforces.
Yeah.
When we can turn cases around, and in some areas, prosecutors are not necessarily aligned with the goals of the police department. And when you have to bring in evidence that is more compelling than you did before, you're going to be able to bolster that capability as well and put the agency in a better place to serve the community and have better outcomes at court. Additionally, you're in a position to actually prevent some future crime. And I think we've got to do a good job of touting the instances where that happened. And we lived that several times with digital, either related to child sex offenses or some violent crime that we were able to detect earlier before something bad happened.
I'm thinking of it in police terms. It's the difference of being proactive versus reactive, right? And
yeah, very much so.
Law enforcement agencies as a whole, when it comes to things like effecting change within the department, have largely always been a reactive force. There's always the joke, this policy is named after a certain person, right? Because they did something that forced the creation of a policy. And I think it's important that we get out, like you're saying, in front of this, so that it's not, hey, why do you have this lab that does what you need? Well, because last year we, lost a case or didn't solve a case or whatever it is because we waited too long, because we didn't take it seriously at the time.
And if you do that in a transparent way, you can actually win the community over, because I'd submit to any leader that when you show like, hey, we're investing in our capacity to solve more crime, and you do that in such a way that they're not concerned with, hey, are they buying surveillance technology? And you show like, hey, these are forensic tools.
Yep.
Because we lived that, where we, invited the media in for a day, and they shot a lot of footage and talked to some of our personnel. And we talked about cases we had worked and where they had made a difference. And when you looked at the public comments on social media, when you looked at some of the comments that were made related to that broadcast, they were overwhelmingly favorable, where people were saying like, oh, I'm glad I live someplace where the police department's effective and they're, we have really smart police here with really important tools and that sort of thing. So it was, in my experience, it was quite beneficial.
Yeah. We've had a lot of good conversation today. I really, I'm very excited about everything that you said. You laid down some really good points, and it's nice to hear it from a commander, right? From that higher up, because a lot of times it's us in the lab, right?
Sure.
And we talked about it on the last episode. I think Tim brought it up that, there needs to be a bottom up approach. There also needs to be a top down approach. And, maybe this gets in the hands of, the right people, and they can hear it from you, and it helps to bring it down. But I'm very hopeful that this does kind of help affect some of that paradigm shift that needs to happen.
And the other thing I would mention is, like Cellebrite's very committed to the center of excellence. Mm-hmm. And you have multiple people who did serve as police leaders, but who also touched this kind of technology, made some of these decisions. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers or know the way, but I'm aware usually of a way. And I always like collaborating with stakeholders and listening to their challenges and seeing like, hey, where might we be able to make a difference, and where can we add some value? And that's like not a a cost thing. It's not a sales thing. Nobody tries to upsell anybody. It's just former law enforcement leaders who have been a little bit further down this road than perhaps other people have, serving as a resource to peers and talking through some of these challenges and looking at like, hey, how could we shore this up? And, because it's a complicated undertaking. It can be a big problem or at least a big challenge. And I'm more than happy to help any agency that reaches out and says like, hey, we're thinking about some things. How should we be framing our thoughts around addressing this issue?
Awesome. That's actually fantastic. And you do have an email, christian.quinn@cellebrite.com. So
yep.
If anybody does have any questions, you feel free to reach out to him that way. All right, Christian. Well, I think we're right at about time here. So
yeah, thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, and we'll hopefully we'll be able to sit down again in the future and do some more. So
yeah, sounds good.
All right, and that concludes our episode today. Thanks again, everyone, for joining and listening. I hope that you found this to be educational and informative. And a little bit entertaining. So definitely we'll see you guys on the next one. We've got a lot more content, some good stuff that's been pre-recorded that we're working on now. And we'll see you in the future. If you need to get a hold of me, it's podcast@cellebrite.com, or you can get me on Twitter at carved_from or Matt Forensic. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next one.